Hello, I'm Shaila Catherine, an American Buddhist Dharma teacher, and I'm delighted to be sharing a topic with you today. I'd like to begin with a quote from the Buddha from the Anguttara Nikaya, which is the numerical discourses of the Buddha, where he said, "You should not be a hasty critic of people, should not lightly pass judgment on people. One who passes judgment on people harms himself." Now, the challenge with giving a talk on judgment is to do so without sounding totally judgmental. Judging isn't necessarily antithetical to spiritual practice. We need the ability to discern accurately what is useful, what is skillful, what is helpful, and distinguish that from what is unwholesome, what is unskillful, what is unhelpful. Wise discernment does not need to lead to a habitual expression of contempt. Critical inquiry does not need to undermine the views and the perspectives and experiences of others. It's not about approving or disapproving. A discerning critical mind is adaptable and flexible because it's not rigidly adhering to fixed views. The essential mode of wisdom, discernment. In Pali, the term is panya. This is the ability that we have to look at our thoughts, our words, and our actions and recognize, discern if their roots are wholesome or if they're unwholesome. Do they lead to happiness or do they lead to suffering? And then we reflect to see to what extent our actions are actually leading to positive results. We consider our intentions and we consider the effects. This quality of discernment is very different from habitually comparing my opinion against the views of others, assuming that I know best, that I am right, and others must be ignorant or wrong if they have a different view. So please don't confuse being judgmental with a clear, wise, critical inquiry or an act of good judgment. Being judgmental, fault-finding, unappreciative, being hypercritical, condemning, complaining, quick to dismiss the opinions of others, these are the unskillful, the unwholesome aspects of being judgmental that I am primarily speaking to in this talk. These are states and expressions of aversion, of ill will. In Pali, the term is dosa. They are called dosa states. They can lead to hatred. It may be common and sometimes even socially acceptable to have very judgmental thoughts, but nevertheless, it's still a dosa state. But the exercise of wise judgment, on the other hand, what we might call discernment or wisdom, is actually skillful because it's not rooted in dosa. It's not rooted in aversion, ill will, or hatred. It's rooted in non-delusion and non-hatred, what's called amoha and adosa in Pali. The exercise of good judgment in the discernment of subtle distinctions helps us discover potential areas for improvement. It helps us cultivate the ability to wisely assess ourselves and allows us to be able to welcome criticism from others that can help us see things we might not have seen from our own perspective and might support our growth. People sometimes praise acceptance as a profound spiritual quality. And you might be surprised to learn that the Buddha actually didn't speak much about acceptance. I couldn't find any contexts in the suttas in which he taught acceptance as such. More frequently, he openly and vigorously criticized his disciples for even trivial transgressions. And he was known to criticize teachers of other sects for what he considered to be wrong views that steered people away from a liberating path. He criticized ritual sacrifices. He criticized ascetic practices and self-mortification practices that some people at the time thought would purify the mind from harmful or from past harmful actions or karma. If the Buddha was afraid to rock the social boat, he might never have recognized the limitations of his own two first teachers, his two meditation masters. He completed their course of training, succeeded within that school of thought, but eventually left their communities because it was not the liberating path. And then he went on and discovered the path to awakening. If he was afraid to rock the social boat, he would not have rejected caste hierarchies. He actually set very high standards for his disciples as well as for himself. He searched for complete enlightenment and he attained it. And he criticized others who stopped short. But the path of liberation is not always going to be clear and easy. Sometimes great beauty arises from very difficult and unexpected conditions. I can remember a time I was walking down the street in my neighborhood in the springtime, and there were beautiful roses and irises and flowers in people's yards, and I was enjoying the walk, admiring some people's flowers in the front of their house. But then I crossed the street, and I noticed that in a crack, just a little crevice in the asphalt in the middle of the street, was this tiny little flower, just the tiniest little thing, but in full bloom. I mean, it was not even an inch tall, the whole plant. And it just struck me how incredibly beautiful this was. Amazing that it had survived in the middle of the road under such harsh conditions and still found a way to blossom. There's no point in judging that flower was small, because if we don't know the conditions that something is growing in, or compare it to conditions that are not available to it, well, on what basis is that judgment? Should I compare that tiny little flower in the middle of the road to the roses that are getting fertilizer and have an irrigation system? It would make no sense. So maybe there's also no point in judging our coworkers for their impatience when we don't know what happened at the breakfast table that morning. No one really knows what's going on in somebody else's life. We don't know what their stresses are. We don't know what they're coping with. We should not demand that our colleagues and our friends tell us all their secrets and have to bare their souls to us in order to earn our patience and receive our tolerance and our mercy. It can be our practice to simply offer patience, kindness, tolerance, good wishes without that exchange of power. Please reflect for a moment. How does it feel when you are judged? And how does it feel to do the judging? When you're judged, do you feel strong? Does it tend to bring out the best in you? Or does it increase your feelings of insecurity, or maybe even increase the chance of failure? How do you respond to the challenge of another person's judgment? Do you feel diminished by it? Does it feel like you're under attack? Does it spark a counterattack, a response of anger or aversion? What patterns are triggered within you when you feel that you are being judged? Some people withdraw, feel shame, self-loathing. Some people react with resentment or anger, fear. Some people want to please the person, desire approval, or get involved in thoughts of blame. Judging indulges a subtle, aversive tendency of mind, arrogant thoughts. These defilements of anger and conceit will certainly be present. Anytime we're engaged in a judging dynamic, look for subtle anger, look for subtle conceit. Judging tends to close off communication and create a sense of separation, discomfort in relationships. It can create distance between friends and mistrust within families. Maybe one brother, for example, might have succeeded financially, got a good job in making lots of money, and the other brother maybe not so much. And perhaps sometimes there's judging in the family, as one is a success and the other a failure. And in subtle ways, just very subtle ways sometimes, there's a putting down of one and an elevating of another. We have to notice the various times we put somebody up in praise or put them down in blame, even in subtle judging dynamics. Sometimes we discover our spiritual lives with great enthusiasm, often when we first find an amazing teacher or an amazing practice that really touches us deeply. And we become such gung-ho practitioners that we judge all our friends and family for their material pursuits. Maybe we've elevated somebody as being a very great spiritual being. And then we happened to walk by the local barbecue and see that they're sitting on the benches outside, munching on ribs and drinking Coca-Cola or Pepsi. And then we judge them. Oh, well, maybe they're not as, above us all as we might have thought. The problem with judging isn't just putting somebody down. There's also a distortion when we lift somebody up. Sometimes we have great insights into all kinds of things, into the experience of emptiness, into the impermanence of all things, into the characteristics of a deeply calm and peaceful mind. And then we enter into a discussion group within our spiritual community, and we might find our mind judging other people who are struggling with inferior questions and problems, like dealing with anger or lust in their mind. Whereas, we're beyond all that. We are aware of emptiness or aware of peacefulness or whatever. Perhaps sometimes we just don't get the attention that we want, maybe from our teacher. And then we tend to find fault with that person, with that teacher. We have to see when we set up a judgment, how we react, not only when somebody judges us, but how our own judgments corrupt our relationships and distort our perceptions. People often slide into judgmental habits when they feel insecure. When we're judging, we are relating not to the other person and the conditions at hand. We are relating to our own projections, our thoughts, and our fears. We're not actually encountering the person who we are judging as they are in the present moment. And when we look closely at the things we judge other people for, very often it's things from the past. Sometimes in the fantasy world of our judging minds, we just don't have to deal with the murkiness and the uncertainty of the present. And so we withdraw to some sort of story of the situation that we have already kind of codified in our mind. Most untrained minds live in a bubble of thoughts, the wandering mind, reinforcing past narratives rather than the vitality and vulnerability of the living present. An angry, self-protective position does not make us happy or free. It is not a mindful position to take. An American Dharma teacher, Sharon Salzberg, said, "If judgment were a liberating path, we'd all have been free long ago. Usually, judgments say a lot more about the person doing the judging than about anyone else. And that may be why they're so seductive. Because each time we express a judgment, we are declaring who we are in comparison. We are asserting our own self-view in the world. We are reinforcing the defilement of conceit. Usually we judge from a very limited perspective. There's an ancient metaphor and story that we find in the Buddhist scripture called the Udana, where a king calls together a group of blind men and asks them to each approach an elephant that they have placed in the center of this ring, and to please describe the elephant. And the blind person who approaches the trunk feels the trunk and says, oh, the elephant is just like a hose. But another one approaches the tail and says, no, 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 the elephant is just like a whisk broom. And another one approaches the leg and says, you're wrong. An elephant is just like a tree trunk. Who knows what the elephant is actually like? Can we accurately describe an elephant from anything other than a limited and distorted personal perspective? And the elephant illustration is it's an innocuous example. And often judgment can feel very harsh and abrasive because of the unrecognized aversion. But really, whenever we are asserting a judgment, we are coming from just one very limited perspective, much like the blind men in this simile. I think one of the reasons we work so diligently, though, to overcome this habit of judging in meditation is because we recognize in it three obstacles. It's very common when people sit down to begin a meditation practice, beginners often see the judging mind. It's a very, very common phenomena and pattern of mind. And within that judging mind, we can also recognize the aggression, the aversion. We can recognize the conceit and the arrogance. And we can also see how it reinforces the attachment to views and opinions. All three of these, aversion, conceit, and the attachment to views and opinions, are strong obstacles that will hinder our progress on the path of awakening. Most meditators have felt the suffering of these patterns and want to free the mind from their grip. We know there's no peace in aggression, aversion, or conceit. We know there's no truth in attachment to views and opinions. Surely we're all seeking something more real than the opinions we have about things, something more loving and connected than conceit and aversion. For many people, judging is deeply ingrained, though, and much of our mindfulness meditation practice must be dedicated to seeing the patterns of our mind, even this pattern of judging, because it may sometimes even feel difficult to experience anything without judging them. Because for some people, this is a deeply rooted pattern. And whatever they see, hear, smell, taste, touch, or think, right on the heels of that experience, if there isn't mindfulness, is a judgment. Ooh, I like this. Ooh, I don't like this. We judge it positively with praise or negatively by finding fault with it. But this pattern of chronic judgment just keeps reinforcing the roots of suffering in aversion, conceit, and the attachment to views. That's why it's so important that as meditators, we look mindfully at this tendency to compare, to judge. so that we can loosen its grip over our perceptions and end that distorting aspect of the judging mind. Working with the judging mind, like any aversive state, requires a little commitment, because it's not very pleasant. It can actually be quite disturbing. We can recognize the anger in a cold, harsh form, a veiled expression of conceit, an intellectualized act of violence, a subtle form of attack meant to belittle another. And we don't like seeing that arise in our own minds. Judging projects our feelings onto others, either by praising or by blaming external conditions. It keeps our orientation external, preventing an intimate encounter with the functioning of our own minds. It's very important, as we practice mindfulness of our own minds, that we see whatever patterns may be arising, including this common habit of the comparing mind, the judging mind. How do you relate to judgment when you're doing the judging? How do you relate to judgment when you discover that this subtle form of arrogant anger has overtaken your mind? We practice mindfulness of the judgment. We recognize that judgment has arisen within our own minds, but we don't just note judging, thinking, judging, comparing. We have to look a little further, investigate a little bit more, see what it is serving us psychologically, socially. Are we getting some reward, some benefit, some experience of pleasure or reinforcement out of that habitual act of judging? What are we getting out of it? When we receive feedback and criticism from other people, this can be another way to learn about our own habits, our own patterns. Sometimes feedback is requested and other times unrequested. But at one time or another, we're all going to hear the views that other people have of us, their judgments, their opinions of us. Sometimes they tell us to our face, and sometimes through gossip. Sometimes it may even be praise, a positive judgment, and other times blame, an angry, negative judgment. Sometimes, though, what people judge, we might see from a different perspective. Sometimes what to one person appears to be a weakness, from another perspective is a strength. Is somebody stubborn, or are they determined? Is somebody weak and afraid, or are they gentle and cautious? Is somebody confident, or are they arrogant? Who's to judge? One time I was traveling with a group of acquaintances, and most of them were involved in a kind of a community feedback process that they were enjoying, where they would meet together in the evenings and kind of give each other feedback about what they thought of each other. And at the time, I actually had a kind of a fever, of a sickness of some kind, and would mostly just kind of go to bed in the evening. And was not really interested in partaking of this communal feedback session. And even after the fever passed and I recovered, I really wasn't interested in joining their discussions. But after they finished giving each other all their feedback, well, the only other person around was to come up with a list of faults of me. So even in my absence from the dynamic, they came up with a whole long list of all my faults and insisted that I hear them out. And it was actually an interesting thing to listen to, because what was so surprising to me and I hadn't expected was that so much of what they found, what they were critical of, were actually things that I valued. we have different human qualities. And listening to them, I really realized that I didn't want to become the kind of person that they desired me to be. And I think sometimes we forget that when we're making a judgment, we think our perspective is right. And we need to pause and recognize that somebody else might be living a different life and have different values or have different aspirations or really want to live in a different way. It's all too easy to find fault with other people or interpret their qualities that are different than ours as faults, rather than to try to see them from their perspective as different life choices. Remember the quote from the Buddha that I read at the beginning, where he said, "You should not be a hasty critic of people, should not lightly pass judgment on people. One who passes judgment on people harms oneself." It continued for another sentence, and it says, "I alone, or one like me, may pass judgment on people." Well, you might think, well, now that's arrogant. Well, actually, I don't think so, because the context of this conversation was where a group of disciples were sitting around talking about other people's attainments. They were talking about the level of enlightenment that other people might have had, their potential rebirth destinations, their advances or attainments in concentration. And the Buddha was basically asking them, do you really think you're in a position to accurately and fairly pass judgment on this? Do you really know how somebody should be in their lives and where they are in their spiritual development? If we looked at our judgments and really asked ourselves, are we in a position to judge this? I think we might cut the number of judgments right then and there, at least in half. Are we really in a position to know for sure? If you feel the urgent need to tell someone what you think of them, first consider, what is motivating that urge to speak? What benefit is there for you in asserting the judgment? Is the judgment creating a subtle sense of superiority within you, a sense of being better than somebody, a judgment over somebody that we might maybe just not particularly like their personality, or don't understand them, or don't feel immediately kind of akin to? Sometimes we judge people because we feel intimidated by them, and the judgment asserts a sense of power over them in our own minds. Or we see a trait in them that we just find difficult, and we react with aversion. You might try first to see if the qualities that you're condemning, can you view them from a less pejorative perspective? Could there be a way to see them as being useful? Valuable. For example, when somebody's stubborn, are you seeing them really as stubborn, or is it possible that they could be deeply committed? What's the difference? Consider if you possess the same qualities that you condemn, because sometimes we judge outward because we don't want to deal with a change inward. There will be times when criticism, when feedback and judgment is actually useful, even when it's solicited, when it's asked of us. So it is helpful sometimes to be able to articulate our genuine criticisms of others, but we should reflect on wise speech before speaking. What is the purpose of telling someone what we think of them? Is it the right time? Are they actually interested? Are we articulating it in a wise way, or in a judgment, is it in a harsh or condemning way? Is our heart affected by anger and aversion, or is it suffused with loving kindness as we speak? Feedback can be a great gift that we give to others, but it can also be a deep form of attack. And it's vital to consider our intentions before we speak. Also to consider the context, because not all relationships have a shared interest in personal growth. Some friendships are just about going to the movies together or sharing time together or hanging out with the kids at the playground. We may cherish growthful, challenging relationships, but sometimes we just want ease or relaxation or a little fun. Sometimes different people have different ideas of what they want in that relationship. And sometimes one relationship between two people can, at different times and in different contexts, be involved in different roles. Maybe on the weekdays, somebody's our boss, and on the weekends, our friend. Sometimes I go to a meditation retreat as a participant, and other times I go in the role of the teacher. Those are very different roles. Sometimes there are both personal and professional dimensions in one relationship, and we must be sensitive to these dynamics to assess when feedback would be beneficial and how to give it in the most appropriate and effective way. And in the process of hearing feedback, working with feedback, we can also learn to receive it more gracefully. In the Samyutta Nikaya, the Susima Sutta, there's a discourse in which the Buddha's chief disciple, Venerable Sariputta, is corrected by a little novice monk. And the little monk, the child, criticizes this great disciple for allowing his robe to not hang properly. But what's lovely in this little discourse is that Venerable Sariputta accepts the criticism, corrects the mistake of his robe hanging improperly, and then honors the novice as his teacher. So he was able to receive the correction with appreciation, equanimity, and humility. Now, sometimes it might be just so cute that this little novice corrected the great disciple of the Buddha. But many times there are status differences and we react differently because of the power dynamic of judgments, depending upon who we consider to have status. Can we find some ways to let go of some of the social statuses and just look at what the criticism is? And is it accurate or not? Some of you may know that I've been teaching a form of deep meditation practice that really emphasizes strong absorption states of concentration called jhanas. And I've been teaching this since 2004. So over a couple of decades now, I've seen many people go through retreats and seen what the hindrances are. And unfortunately, the comparing mind is a hindrance to the development of this practice, but it comes up quite frequently because any system that has these systematic attainments of states where one learns to develop the mind and then enter a deep meditative state, emerge from it, and then enter the next one, with each state having very defined qualities and characteristics. It's sort of prone to assessment, self-assessment, and comparison with others. When there's specific stages like first jhana, second jhana, third jhana, fourth jhana, and various attainments, it's just right. The situation is rife for judgment. And it gets even worse because progress is often dependent. Progress through the system is dependent upon the teacher determining if sufficient stability has been attained at each level before instructions are given for the next one. And so meditators come to the teacher and want confirmation. Ooh, Was this the state? And it is important for the teacher to assess the state, no doubt. But too often, instead of assessing the state, people take the assessment as a personal, assessing the person, the value of the person. This was good. They're good, or they're bad, or they're succeeding, or they're failing, or they're being recognized and seen, or not being understood. And it's a real challenge to get through the arrogance and the self perspectives in order to just see the experiences that we have in relationship to the criteria of how the states are defined, not in terms of what I want, but just in terms of where it's leading. So this kind of dynamic is fraught with concern that one teacher is too strict, too demanding, and another teacher is too lenient. The very first time I attended a jhana retreat a long time ago, I was a participant in this retreat, and I was assigned a little service job to chop vegetables in the kitchen along with a team of other participants. And we were supposed to be in silence. But whenever the cook left the kitchen, somebody would start whispering enticing descriptions of their newfound jhanic bliss. Now, on that veggie chopping team, the spirit was basically good. It was a good spirited sharing, but it was totally unskillful and inappropriate because there was a lot of conceit, a lot of comparing going on, with one person saying, "Ooh, I got to the second jhana. Ooh, I got to the third jhana. Have you gotten to the first jhana yet?" It's so much more powerful to simply be mindful of the experience that we're having. I've often practiced in monastic retreats where the meetings with the teacher are held in somewhat public forums, in the sense that the teacher's room has a few other people in it. The door is opened to the hallway or to the outside, where the next people that are going to come in and report about their meditation, practice, and speak with the teacher are waiting. So basically, there's a lot of people within earshot. It's not like a private dialogue with the teacher. The Dharma and the minds, they're considered to be open. Your mind is not so different than my mind. So we just talk about the mind as the mind, and what we're experiencing without needing to take it too personally. So it's very common to have this sort of open forum with the teachers, rather than a kind of private encounter as we might think of a therapeutic encounter in the West. So in Asia, and in Asian settings, this is very normal to have that openness. But it can trigger quite a lot of comparing mind and self-judgment and aversion in some people. And sometimes even very experienced meditators forget to simply be mindful and guard their minds as they hear other people's experience. In fact, one friend told me that he found that it was easy to listen to meditators who were struggling to stabilize their concentration and attain absorption. But he did not want to hear the descriptions of meditators who were progressing through the system of deep meditative absorption with depth and with ease. And so much so that he complained to the office. And soon after, a little white noise machine appeared outside the teacher meeting room. I thought that was quite intriguing. Do you assess your self-worth through comparison with others? Do you assess where you think you should be based upon where other people are? Do you find fault with others when they succeed, or feel jealous of those who are successful and have good fortune? Do you apologize for your own genuine achievements out of fear of triggering the envy of others? The mind can judge anything and everything if given free rein, but this habit quickly gets tedious. My teacher in India, Punjaji, used to warn disciples not to judge others, for if we did, We would have to be reborn again and again just to keep judging them. If blinded by the belief that our judgments are right, we might take our own thoughts just a little too seriously. And judgments are just thoughts, conditioned patterns of the mind that tend to reinforce a particular belief in self as better or as worse, as superior or as inferior, as one who knows better than others, or perhaps one who is deeply impressed by others. With mindfulness practice, we can learn to recognize the judging mind. We can observe it arise and pass away, being seen as it appears with mindfulness, seeing its effect on our mind with mindfulness, and letting it pass away with mindfulness, knowing it has ended. That thought has come, but it has gone. We don't need to invest the judgment with a belief that it is true just because we thought it. And we don't need to judge ourselves as being a terrible person because we're judging. We can train ourselves to disengage from the seductive draw of the judging mind. It's just another thought pattern that arises and passes away. And we can let this deep pattern of judging and comparing be seen and exposed in the light of mindfulness and then fall away. So it no longer corrupts the clarity of our view and we can see things just as they are. I'd like to close this talk with just a few suggestions of little tools or tips that you might use if you are somebody who is working actively with the judging mind. The first is to, as I spoke in the talk, to investigate it, to really take the time to recognize that this is judging and to observe how it arose and how it affects you. We have to see the effect of judging in our own minds clearly enough that we understand why we don't want to indulge in that pattern anymore. We have to see if it's giving us some kind of superficial reward, like some pleasure. Often people do feel a kind of a boost of pleasantness with the conceit and arrogance that comes with judging and comparing, because it pushes the sense of arrogance forward, and arrogance has a kind of pleasantness of it. So we have to look at that and see that that pleasantness actually is not as pleasant as we thought it might, as we think it might be. It actually leads to a delusion and disempowerment. So we have to investigate how we're experiencing judgment and why it's hooking us, why it's repeating in our own mind, and consider where it's leading. And then we might sometimes need little tools just to neutralize it, because sometimes we can see the judging, but we need to kind of find our balance and our equanimity before we can do any reflection or investigation of it. And sometimes we just don't want to investigate every single thought. Of course, that would be exhausting. So just having a way to neutralize it can also be very helpful. And one suggestion is to, just say, okay, so we have this judgmental thought of somebody, and then we link to it an ordinary thought, just something that has not much grip to it, like the grass is green, the sky is blue. One of my teachers used to always just say, after the judgment, just say the sky is blue. It's sort of like, okay, big deal. That's not a big deal judgment, right? It's just a recognition. Okay. So we take some of the sting away, the aversion out of it, and recognize it's just a thought from a particular perspective. We can, once in a while, and I don't recommend doing this very often, just like a couple of times just to see where it's leading, is we can actually let it run its course. We can amplify it a little bit until it becomes ludicrous. until we maybe we have a self-judgment about ourselves, and then we let it roll and see how it leads to really kind of ridiculous thoughts about being the worst person in the whole world, blah, 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 blah. And we can see that the chain of thoughts is not actually based on any reality or anything that from a reasonable perspective, even we would say is true. Very often, just seeing it with mindfulness and recognizing this is judgment, calling it by its name, is sufficient. And it can be fun once in a while if you wonder how obsessed you are with judging. Just count them in a day. See how many judgmental thoughts you have in one day, or just the morning. How many judgmental thoughts do you have? It's such a burden to go through life judging and judging and judging and judging. And with every judgment, we are caught in our view of the experience. We are not engaged with an intimate and mindful connection with the experience. So if we see a lot of judging in their mind, we'll also experience quite a lot of alienation from the actual experience of the present moment. And sometimes when we find ourselves judging, we can ask, well, how would I react if somebody else was telling me that thought? Would we find it offensive? And maybe it's a thought about a judgment about ourselves. Would our friends actually agree? Sometimes we can try and get out of the entanglement of our own viewpoint by imagining the viewpoint of somebody else. And that can be sometimes help us kind of disentangle ourselves from the whole complex pattern of attachment there. So hopefully that gives you a few ways to approach the judging mind. Overall, I think being mindful of our experience, recognizing judging thoughts as just judging thoughts, investigating them, and finding different ways of working with them in context appropriate situations. So we might work differently if it's a self-judgmental thought or if it's a judgment of others. So please enjoy your exploration of your own mind, and may it lead to great clarity, peace, and awakening. Thank you.